All right, welcome back to the Joy of Medicine. We're happy to be here. I'm Trey Cashion. That's Dr. Richard Cashion, or as I like to call him, Dad. And over there behind the screen is Caleb doing his magic. And we got a guest today we're really excited about. He's been a friend of my dad's for 55 years. I think we
we just figured it out that Shelley and I met. I was what they call a fellow, which was being trained in cardiology at the time at Georgetown University, and Shelley was a medical student, and we met in his rotation through cardiology.
Awesome.
And I was at the time so revved up and excited about the place that I had trained in Boston that I, good or bad, I influenced him probably a little bit, and he ended up being an intern at that place, and I ended up being chief resident. And so I had this unhappy intern, Sheldon Rubenfeld, I think has blamed me for getting him up in that fire pit. But anyway,
it's all worked out though.
It worked out great.
And then we both wound up again in Texas,
right?
In Houston.
That's right, at Baylor in Houston. So anyway, Shelley has been teaching. I guess was the course medicine after the Holocaust, Shelley? What was it?
It was called Healing by Killing: Medicine During the Third Reich.
Wow. Yeah.
What a name.
That'll get your attention.
Tell us how long did the show go?
Well, I started teaching there about 20 years, teaching that course about 20 years ago. I taught other courses there as well, but that was my main course. And it came about because in 1998, I wanted a trip called the March of the Living. March of the Living is a trip sponsored by, the organization March of the Living, but it was founded by a member of the Israeli Knesset or parliament who was sitting on the beach in the 80s and heard some teenagers talking about their high school having to write an essay. One of them said he was going to write about the Holocaust. And the other kid says, man, that's ancient history. Nobody wants to hear about that or know about it. This member of the Knesset, who was a Holocaust survivor, went over to them, started talking. We realized they don't know anything about it. And he started his March of the Living. So at that time, every 2 years, they took kids from around the world between 11th and 12th grade, and they took them to Poland and then to Israel. So my son went on that in 1996, and I went as a teacher in 1998. So I'm standing on the Auschwitz wondering why a doctor, Joseph Mengele, was required of the ramps of Auschwitz to say, you go to the gas chamber, you go work. And it troubled me. So I started reading about it, speaking about it, teaching about it, and ultimately started teaching a course and created a nonprofit called the Center for Medicine After the Holocaust. So that's how it all got started. And it's a very interesting subject, in part because at the time, the Germans were the best doctors in the world by far. Being we're all in Texas, you might know Michael DeBakey. Michael DeBakey studied medicine in Nazi Germany. And he went there because he said if you wanted to be a serious doctor and do research, there was simply no place in the United States where you could do that. So he went to Germany in the 19th study there because they were simply the best doctors in the world. And many of the things that we take for granted today in our own medical system really are derived from German medicine. Like we think of scientific medicine. That was started by the Germans in the 1840s, which is one of the reasons so many people went to study there. Oslo went to study there. Many people went to study there. And in 1910, Carnegie Foundation sent Flexner over to Germany and the rest of Europe to the American medical education system was simply an apprentice system back then. And in Canada and the United States at that time, there were around 155 medical schools, very few with universities. And in a few decades, they're down to about 35 medical schools. And all of them were affiliated by universities. So that's just an example of how German medicine influences what goes on today. In fact, our medical education system, how our students are trained, are modeled after the German medical education system. Most people are not well aware of it. There are so many other things that refer back to Germany and their approach to medicine, like the welfare state. That was Count Bismarck in the 1880s, health insurance. And by the early 1900s, many countries had adopted health insurance. The German model, Teddy Roosevelt tried to adopt that in 1912 when he ran for president of the Progressive Party, but he was unsuccessful. Ultimately, we got around to having it in the 1960s with Medicare. But they were emulating Germany. And then you think of all the research ethics we have, IRBs and such, that came straight out of the trial of Nazi doctors in 1946 and the Nuremberg Code, which was ignored for 20 years. But then when the Tuskegee syphilis experiments hit the newspapers, all of a sudden they remember this Nuremberg Code. And from that, we got federal regulations about research, IRBs, and all the rest. That came straight out of the Nuremberg doctors' trials. There were so many things that happened back then that influenced American medicine. We don't like to think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway, so you got involved with this, and then you somehow in your teaching, you're actually teaching through Baylor College of Medicine this course. Tell me a little bit about that.
The course was an elective course. It ran for 8 or 9 sessions. We reviewed the history of how doctors behaved during the Third Reich, the lead up to it, how they were excellent doctors, and how they bought into this concept of eugenics. Eugenics is essentially breeding humans. You want the best humans possible. It was not a German idea. It was actually founded by a British guy, Francis Galton, who was a cousin of Charles Darwin. And the leaders in the world of eugenics at that time was the United States. We had involuntary compulsory sterilization starting in 1907. We had immigration restriction after in 1924 with legislation, which is one of the reasons Jews could not get out of Europe and come to the United States. And the Germans were trying to catch up to the United States eugenic programs. When Hitler learned about eugenics while he was in prison, he developed an entire political philosophy based upon eugenics, trying to improve the German stock, get rid of those with inferior stock, which would be Jews, blacks, gays, and many others. So we describe how that program came about, what eugenics is all about, how they did it. They began by sterilizing German people, mostly in neuropsychiatric hospitals, which were the largest hospitals in the world at the time. And they modeled their sterilization law in 1933 after our own Virginia model sterilization law, which the Supreme Court of the United States said by a margin of 8-1 was constitutional. Wow. So he started by sterilizing Germans, about 400,000 of them. Obviously, doctors were doing a lot of that. Then they had Nuremberg laws to prevent people who were non-Aryans from marrying Aryans. And that was modeled after our Jim Crow laws. And then finally, they initiated a euthanasia program to mercifully kill people with disabilities. And gas chambers were designed as part of that program to murder German adults with disabilities. Euthanasia has been talked about for 30, 40 years already in the United States and Britain and elsewhere, but the Germans actually did it. So they built gas chambers to euthanize people. Then they simply went to the final solution and made much larger gas chambers, crematoria, and they used the same personnel that were in the euthanasia program with physicians to man the crematoria and everything else at the death camps. That's why you have a guy like Joseph Mengele there and many, many other doctors there to make sure that the program was run properly and to give it a medical cast, to make a medical procedure for genetic. So we go through all that in the course. And I have one lecture on why the Jews. And this lecture ultimately got me in trouble at Baylor. In this lecture, I give the history of anti-Semitism. And the purpose being to get the students to speak about their own biases. They're freshman medical students. They have biases. They don't understand how their biases can interfere with their treatment of a patient. And prior to COVID, the students were willing to talk about their biases. They'd say things like, well, yeah, I don't like old people, or I don't like people who take pills, or I don't like whatever. A guy comes in with a tattoo, or whatever they start talking about it. And then they learn how that can interfere with a patient who comes in with a tattoo, or an old person, or people who are demented. After COVID, the students were no longer willing to talk about their biases. And for 20 years, I've been telling them a story about my first year in practice when I had a suicidal Palestinian woman come to see me. And she was getting a graduate degree in pharmacology or pharmacy, I can't remember which. And I told them that one of the key questions you ask a suicidal patient is, how would you kill yourself? Well, I just bought a gun, and after this visit with you, I'm going to go home and shoot myself. You have a medical emergency. If they say, hey, I don't know, I haven't thought about it yet, I have some time to get into a psychiatrist and do all the rest. But she was a Palestinian woman, and I'm a Zionist. And I knew right away, a flag went up, that I have to be careful. So I didn't want that to influence how I treated this patient. I told the students, if I wasn't careful, I could say, you're a PhD in pharmacology or pharmacy. You have access to all these fatal drugs. Have you thought about killing yourself by taking those fatal drugs? That would be letting my biases, one, be unacknowledged, and two, failing to act on my own biases. So I use that as an example. A student filed an anonymous grievance about my use of the word Palestinian. And I was unaware that such a thing existed at Baylor, but I discovered that Baylor encourages students to file anonymous grievances, which was a shocker to me. And talking to some of my interlocutors at Baylor, they told me that they treat students, medical students, as a vulnerable population, which again was shocking to me, that some of the most privileged students in the world are treated as a vulnerable population, as opposed to their patients, who are really the vulnerable population. So they told me if I had any more grievances, my course could be canceled. Well, I didn't have any more grievances, but they canceled my course anyway. At the same time, Baylor Grand Rounds had set up a lecture on anti-Semitism in medicine long before, well, actually around the same time I was teaching that course, and the lecture was going to be given by Dr. Peter Hotez. And me, Peter Hotez is a vaccinologist. He developed a COVID vaccine that's used throughout the world, patent-free. It's one of the vaccines, the halal vaccine. So it's used by Muslims. He was nominated for the Nobel Prize in 2022. And he gets death threats all the time. So he and I were going to talk about anti-Semitism in medicine. Well, ultimately, they canceled that lecture and failed to renew my appointment at Baylor after 50 years. Right before that, they had Baylor commencement. And at the Baylor commencement, they had the graduating senior student spokesperson who went on a 4-minute rant about different grievances, Black Lives Matter, George Floyd, and literally accused Israel of committing genocide. She was wearing a hijab, and a dozen students went to get their degrees. They were wearing their stoles, and they had Palestinian flags on them. They had Israel wiped off the map. In Arabic, they had Jerusalem is ours, Palestine is ours. So there was a lot of overt anti-Semitism at...
That was at graduation, yeah.
That's right, May of 2024. So I think Baylor has a real issue. It comes out of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, which leads to their treating students as a vulnerable population and be oppressed by oppressors. And from DEI, they learn that white people only can be oppressors, particularly white, elderly, Jewish, heterosexual men like me. So I was a prime target. I think, Dick, you would be a target too.
Yeah, I would. I'm on their list.
Yeah, I think you are.
Right.
Well, so getting back to, so how does that underlying kind of philosophy, like the eugenics and stuff, get past? I would assume, I've always heard that the doctors used to take the Hippocratic oath, right? With first do no harm. How does it get to where that's replaced by a philosophy that's killing?
Trey, you ask a very seminal question. What the Nazis did is this. The Hippocratic Oath is all about the doctor-patient relationship. The Nazis transformed it to the state-voke relationship, where the state is a doctor. In fact, that posters of Hitler saying the doctor of the German people. But now the individual patient was not the patient, it was the German population, the Volk. So to keep the genetic stock pure, you had to eliminate those people with inferior genes, Jews, blacks, homosexuals. That was their understanding of genetics at the time. So not only did they transform the Hippocratic Oath, they allowed themselves to think they're occupying the moral high ground by implementing their variation on the Hippocratic Oath. After World War II was over, the Hippocratic Oath was dead. If you look at the oaths that are taken in medical schools, in 1993, Ed Pellegrino, who was at Georgetown, where Dick and I were at a world-class ethicist, surveyed 150 medical schools in the United States, see what kind of oaths they take. And about half still took some variation of the traditional oath, and half took a completely different oath. And of those even that used the traditional oath, it was gutted. Like the traditional oath says, strictly verboten, strictly verboten. That only occurred in about 10 or 11% of the oaths as of 1993. Now the oath that they take really has nothing to do with the Hippocratic Oath. So the Nazis transformed it. The Americans rejected it and replaced it with something else.
Wow.
So that's the mindset back then. The doctors thought back then they were really doing God's work, and they were operating according to the Hippocratic principles, which they had transformed.
Which scares the heck out of me, but that's that easy for people to forget that, because I've talked about it. I've been through surgery recently and had COVID, and I'm so grateful for my doctors, because the ones that I've met, I always felt like I was the focus of what they were like. I did feel like they were taking care of me, like what's in the best interest of Trey with regard to this problem. And I do get the feeling sometimes, and this is a very generic statement, that there's a little bit less of that. In fact, one of the conversations I had with one of those doctors was, he said, I wish more doctors were more focused on how do I treat a patient than what somebody else might think about me, or whether I'm going with what the CDC says or whatever. I mean, it would take a very strong person, I think. I'm not saying that's easy to do. I'm just saying in Germany, when you're kind of run over by a powerful dictator, there would be a lot of fear. Were there doctors in Germany that said this is not okay? Or, I'm
very, very few. First of all, they were all on board with the program. The concept of eugenics was adopted by the medical profession long before Hitler ever heard of it. Secondly, so few doctors resisted. They didn't care if they didn't really punish the doctors that resisted, as long as they didn't make a big public stink about it. They said, we want you to go work in the concentration camp. I don't want to do that. They say, okay, because there were many people waiting to take that place. Remember, they were coming out of the Depression. Hitler was giving all this work to sterilize people, which required courts to prove the sterilization. You had to get a doctor's approval to get married, and then you had to work in the so a lot of jobs coming through. So the doctors mostly did not protest. Some did, and they really weren't punished for it, because they had plenty of people who wanted to sign up for the program.
Wow.
When you start dividing people like race, which is what they did then, and you start doing it now, that's what DEI, white people are racist. That's a given. It's part of the DEI protocol. So you're dividing people up by race. And you lose focus of the patient in front of you, because you see them as a member of an ethnic group, just like the Germans did. It's very dangerous. For example, big stink in San Francisco in the labor and delivery wards, patients being treated by a whole bevy of nurses that are wearing Palestinian flags. So imagine you're a Jewish patient and all these nurses are wearing Palestinian flags, and they're trusting your infants to them. That makes them very, very nervous. Now, you'd like to think, well, this is just an expression of how they feel, and it's appropriate, because that's what they've been taught in medical school or nursing school. It's okay to express your feelings. just like they at the commencement. Well, those of us who trained before that, like Dick and myself, we were not trained to express our feelings.
Right.
Yeah. We've talked about this on the show before about the impact of just how somebody approaches another person and what they, and that does have an impact on outcomes and how people respond to treatments. And what you're saying is, it seems like people don't, and maybe that's true. I've fortunately been with good doctors, but it would scare you, right? I mean, it could be anything where you're creating a situation where you can express an opinion, but that opinion might negatively impact your ability to treat somebody.
And remember, we've done several things on the show about how this can influence the outcome. In other words, Herb Benson, a guy that Shelley and I work with in Boston, has written tons of things about how that can influence
Sure.
you.
And I'll tell you how they're. There's a recent study that showed 20 top medical schools that had their curriculum available online for examination. They had to go through 60 medical schools to get 20. They had a very simple experiment. They looked at the curriculum. They picked 8 political terms and 8 scientific terms. So like diversity would be in the political column, anatomy might be in the scientific column. There were more mentions of political terms in the medical school curriculum of these 20 schools than of scientific terms. That's what they're being trained. Plus, Dick, I'm sure, knows that they spend so many fewer hours being trained, and this is what they're learning in those fewer hours that they're being trained.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So they're not very well trained compared to previous generations, and what they're being taught is not helpful in terms of relating to the patient.
And as we were talking even before the show got started, one of the things that both Shelley and I miss being retired is dealing with the patient. I mean, that particular part is the most important thing in my life for that time still, in retrospect. So anyway, Shelley, I wanted to ask you one question related to what we got started with. What's going to happen at Baylor? Are they going to restart your course or what?
No, I'm no longer a Baylor faculty member. What I want to do is just shine some light on it by talking in programs like this and perhaps in the press to let them know what's going on at Baylor. And I hope enough pressure will be brought on the board members that they'll start examining Baylor's pedagogy, which I think is really a bad pedagogy. When you're training your students that their feelings are more important than their responsibilities to the patient, you are asking for trouble, but they're not going to respond unless sufficient pressure is put on the board and give Baylor a real black eye. I mean, they won't correct. And it's not just Baylor. There are so many anti-Semitic incidents in medical circles, professional medical organizations around the country. Baylor's just one. So it's a large, large problem. There's some organizations being founded to fight against it. One is Do No Harm, which was founded by about 10 years ago by a professor who was vice president for curriculum at the University of Pennsylvania. And he was saying, why are we teaching all this garbage? We got to train them to be doctors. And they said, well, that's where we're at. You don't like it, goodbye. So he left. And then there's another new one started called American Medical Association. So people are starting to fight back against DEI. But let me give you an example of how difficult it's going to be. If you think of the medical ethos, the methods in which any organization operates, but we talk about medicine, that ethos is determined by 3 groups: medicine itself, the government or politics or law, and then the culture. During the Nazi era, obviously the politicians were very strong, but so were the doctors. Doctors were extremely highly respected. So they bring eugenics to Hitler, he buys into it, and voila, you have a very terrible public health program to kill a whole bunch of people. The culture was weak. We're in a different situation now. The politics are very strong. DEI is everywhere. The culture is very strong on DEI, as just shown by our recent lecture. Medicine is weak. Medicine has abdicated its responsibilities, has abrogated its mission, to take care of patients. So it's going to be a real slog.
No, I know it is, and it takes steps. The part of this show was that we, I'm not a doctor. I'm just.
But you grew up in a doctor's.
I grew up in a doctor's home, and I work with a lot of them. But I've always said the best healthcare, my opinion, but I think you're actually foundationally saying the same thing, is the doctors need to be the ones, well, properly formed doctors need to be the ones that are leading healthcare. I mean, and I've seen, for different reasons, we've talked about some, like the amount of debt they come out with, and then they're offered big contracts and they end up being employees of large organizations.
And I was told at Baylor, they train them to be employees. They told me they trained them to be employees. Personal preference. I don't want, I want the doctor, and I've talked to several. I have a customer that is trying to leave as an employee, how hard it is, both because of the debt they have and because of how difficult it is with respect to the system as it's set up to be able to get contracts and all that type of stuff. But he said, my two bosses, the ones that oversee what I do, one's an attorney and one's an MBA, and they are over me. And I'm like, I don't want to be treated in that system. I don't want somebody taking care of me, that the doctor is not the one saying, this is the best course of treatment. And as we've talked just now, talked about the fact, if you don't trust the guy that's telling you that, or think that they have some ulterior motive, or somebody else telling them, the trust matters, I think, as a patient. I mean, you need to be able to look the guy in the eye and know he does both have the knowledge, the training as a physician to know what's going on, make the diagnosis, this is the best course of action. But then he also, right together with that, has my best interests as central. Well, that's not the way it operates. Now, I'll give you a couple examples. The joy of medicine comes from the doctor-patient relationship. To really develop a doctor-patient relationship, you have to spend time with the patients.
Yes.
You don't get a relationship unless you spend the time. Secondly, think about what happens. You may have a great doctor you really like, and then God forbid you get sick and wind up in the hospital. Who takes care of you in the hospital?
Right.
Some hospitalist you never met is not particularly interested in your story, often doesn't sit down and actually get an accurate history and physical, goes to the electronic medical record, which may go wrong, and gets upset when you correct it. The third thing, just to kind of put it in a different context, I think Dick and I were trained in what I would call covenantal medicine, which is whatever the patient, we have an agreement, whatever the patient needs, I will do my best to get it. Under contractual medicine, the doctor's saying, or is acting this way, I will do no more than my contract requires. Even more than that, there are often conflicts, ethical conflicts, because your employer is or MBA, and their desires might conflict with the desires of the patient. In covenantal medicine, if we have a problem with the insurance company, the doctor and the patient fight against the insurance company together. But suppose the doctor's working for the insurance company. Tremendous ethical conflicts.
Right.
That's where we're at.
Yeah. Well, we got a ways to go, and I'm curious. I have to keep up with your what's going to happen with you and Baylor. Are you having talks with them, or is that's out of the window?
Well, I'm not talking with Baylor yet. I have a legal defense fund that sent them a letter saying, hey, you need to investigate what happened and reinstate me in the course. And their response, the legal defense fund summed up in 2 words, which I won't say on this podcast.
Oh, wow. Well,
so the battle goes on.
The battle.
So, I mean, again, and I don't know that there must not be a simple answer, but well, it's like everything else. I mean, the system itself, I think, contributes to the problem. I mean, the system as it exists contributes to the problem. I mean, more employed doctors. I was going to say, when I first got into healthcare, I worked for a large group of physicians in Dallas, at Presbyterian Hospital in Dallas. And I remember the idea of, they weren't calling them hospitalists, but the idea of somebody else rounding on my patients, it was not like, oh, that sounds like a good idea. The entirety of all those internal medicine doctors that were sitting in that room were like, you've got to be crazy. There's no way that somebody else is taking care of my patient. I will round on it. And I remember the guy I worked for, who was a businessman, ended up saying, this is the way it's going to go. Well, now it's gone that way.
And it's crazy. How did it get there? But it's there now, 100% virtually. You don't find
Because of
any primary doctors.
Work-life balance.
Right.
You know, everybody wins in that system except for the patients. Now, Dick, you'll appreciate this because you worked at Methodist Hospital. A couple of years ago, the CEO of Methodist Hospital tried a radical idea. She insisted that the hospitalists actually be in the hospital during their shift. They objected to that, and they tried to get the CEO fired. And she finally had to tell them, look, the board is not going to fire me, but I can fire you. So if you don't show up in the hospital, that's what's going to happen. They're shift workers. And they, well,
that's what, so and I'll share this story, my dad, because it was a patient of his who actually was a banker that tried to tell me never to go into banking, but I didn't listen to him. But he tells the story of him having an event where he said, I remember my dad was doctor. You met him at the hospital. It was an emergency situation. And he relays the story that the last thing I heard was your dad calling nurses in to deal with it. Then he was out and he didn't know how long it was, but he woke up in a totally dark room in the middle of the night. And as he woke up, he heard my dad's voice and he said, how you're here? How long has it been? He said, it's probably been 8 or 9 hours. And the guy said, what are you doing here? And something along the lines of, well, I need to stay here until I knew you were better. And I'm thinking that, I mean, I'm prejudiced. It's my dad, but I want doctors like that. I mean, that are concerned enough to stick it out with me and not say, well, you know what?
It's 5 o'clock.
Clock's off. I'm punching out, and we'll see you later.
Well, back in the day, your behavior would be routine. Now, I think it'd be criticized for making everybody else look bad.
Wow. So, hold on.
What happened?
I don't know what happened. But anyway, yeah, I just, that's, how do you get the culture back? Because again, like you said, a lot of the doctors that you've met and plenty that I know are not joyful necessarily in what they do. The ones that are, I actually have a good friend who is a family practice doctor who was at a social gathering with me and was saying that she was leaving to go do some concierge medicine. And I said, well, why is that? And she goes, well, I'm having to see 25 to 30 patients a day. I'm not practicing medicine because I've got to get in and out of a room. I don't know what's, hopefully people can't hear that, but I'm having to get out of a room in 10 minutes. So what's happening is I'm just saying, okay, we'll give you a steroid, we'll give you an antibiotic. And if you're not better in 2 or 3 days, then come back and see me. And she said, I have no joy in doing that. So she went and she just pulled out of everything and said, I'm just going to have so many patients, but I'm going to take care of them. I'm going to be available for them. And her level of joy just in conversations, is noticeable. It's palpable. I mean, you can
Trey,
tell.
I just want to comment because I think that helps doctors have a concierge practice where you take care of 600 or 900 patients. You get $2,000 up front. But when you get sick,
it's a problem.
It will not be your doctor.
Yeah, that's
medicine's dirty little secret right now.
No, I understand, and I don't know how you get there with that because unfortunately I had to spend time in a hospital for the first time as a patient in my entire life. And I was treated very well, very responsive. People listen, but I've heard other stories that haven't gone as well as that. But that I guess that's part of the issue is as I talk to people who are not doctors, who are just patients, regular people, had a conversation yesterday, and he said, I just don't trust many of the people I go see that they're actually looking out and listening to me and trying to respond to use their expertise to take my information and come up with a plan that's in my best interest.
I'll give you just two thoughts. I'll ask your father, who's been around for a while. When you were training in your first 30 years of practice, were there any giants in medicine? Like
Giants?
Really, the big doctors you looked up to?
Well, there's a couple that, but the ones up in Boston that we dealt with, I would think would be considered giants. Finland,
Who
Cass.
are the giants now? Can you name one? Name one medical giant.
To answer your question,
well,
no.
I mean, unfortunately, I would say Anthony Fauci would be the one that would be the giant.
Yeah, I mean, that's very problematic.
But and again, that speaks to the issue. But there is a problem that I'm beginning to hear among people my age, because I'm reaching that age where I'm probably going to be in a hospital another time before it's all over. And there just seems to be like, I got to find the right person. I mean, like if I have to go, I know the doctor I'm going to call, but I had this conversation yesterday. He's my age. And I'm like, I hope I outlive him, which I probably will, but I might not outlive it. I mean, I might outlive his practice, and then I've got a problem because that.
Well, the service I provide for my friends, I tell them, if you get sick, God forbid, and go in the hospital, I will be your advocate. You don't have to worry about that, Trey, because you have your father. For as long,
as long as I'm living, but now at 83, I'm not sure how many years left I've got left.
But everyone needs an advocate. You need somebody to protect you from the system.
Which is why I said to my son Grayson, I said, look, I need you to become not just a doctor, but a great doctor, because I need somebody to advocate for me, because I don't feel comfortable in general if I just walk in and I don't know somebody that sounds very negative, but
you as a patient can tell, for example, when physicians make errors of commission. What you can't tell, what Dick can tell, your father can tell, is when they make errors of omission. They just don't tell you stuff that you don't know that because you don't know they should be telling it to you. Right. Your father, if he was in the room, he would know that. He'd say, wait a minute.
Well, and there's just and I'll just say, and to toot the horn of the guy who did my surgery, and then there was a fellow that was with him, both very kind people. But when I came in, and when they came in to see me following surgery, every time that doctor came in, he sat on the bed next to me, sat on the bed with me, and just put his hand on me and started, how are you doing? And the other guy, when he would round, because the lead surgeon wouldn't come in the morning, so the fellow came in, and he would stand 10 feet from me and ask the same questions. And I can tell you, I felt way more comfortable with the doctor sitting on my bed, who was he's an older doctor.
It would had to be older.
Yeah. I mean, an older doctor, but how much more comfort, like, okay, he cares. Just that the body language of that.
Absolutely. My wife, Oliver Shum, she was in the hospital for 6 days. Not one doctor ever sat down the entire 6 days. I'll give you an example of how that works. How what you're describing is so critical. In my examining room, I use a rolling chair. The examining room table where the patients sit was about this high, and my chair was this high. I did that intentionally because in that examining room, I have all the power. In this setup, they are looking down on me, which restores some agency to them. They don't know that. They don't realize I've done that intentionally. But what you're describing, what you need to do whatever you can to make the patient feel good, feel able to express themselves, make it appear as if you want to listen. So you sit down, you let them look down on you. I mean, these are things that doctors knew, but nobody's teaching it to them now. Nobody
Well, they
wants
should
to
be
hear
they
it.
should be taking the DEI time and teaching that.
Yeah.
because
Well, this
because that it was noticeable to me as a patient when the difference between, I know the other guy's a good doctor. But I wanted to say, hey, you need to learn from the guy you're working with and be okay to come over here at least closer. I'm not saying you have to sit down, but at least closer to me, not talk from 8 feet away. And
When you
and
pull
ask.
up a chair and sit down next to a patient, you're saying, I'm not in a rush. I want to hear what you have to say. Let's talk. When you're
And that's
standing across the room, I got 1 foot out the door. When you're sitting in a chair, it's, I'm here for you.
Yeah,
Amen.
That is so. I just that for all the people to listen, and I know we have some medical students and stuff. I mean, please listen to this, because whether you're learning it or not, it does matter to a patient that you at least give the body language that says, "I'm here for you. What's going on?" And it makes a difference, a huge difference, honestly.
Dick,
So
I think we're getting to that. You and I are getting to that grumpy old man territory.
The grumpy old man.
yeah. Well, anyway,
the older I get, the better I was. Kind of.
Aren't we all that way? I'm starting to say the same things. Well, Dr. Rubenfeld, thank you so much for making time with us. It's so enjoyable. I love the fact that we've had somebody with your experience and both in terms of what you've been through and what you've taught in the past, but also as a physician. It's nice to hear that. And I have to believe that there are going to be, there are going to be some very good doctors, as there are today, that will embrace kind of being what I would call a real physician, not just a technician. I mean, somebody who's there for you as a patient.
I commend you and your dad having this show, and I appreciate the opportunity to be on it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for Shelley for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks, Shelley, for taking the time. I appreciate it very much. Have a great one.